My name is Jack Colton, and if you're hearing this, it means I either succeeded or I failed in the most final way possible. Either way, the story needs to be told. It all started with the lake. I've spent the better part of my 40 years on or in the Great Lakes. Most of that time has been on Lake Superior. People who live by the ocean, they have a certain respect for it, a healthy fear of its power. But Superior, she's different. She's not just powerful, she's ancient and cold, and she doesn't give up her dead or her secrets. I run a one-man commercial diving and salvage operation out of a small harbor near Marquette in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. My boat, the Iron Maiden, is a 45-foot steel-hulled workhorse that's almost as old and tired as I am. It's my office, and most nights, my home. Life is simple, or it was. A shipping company loses a container of machine parts in a squall, they call me. Some rich guy from Chicago sinks his sailboat after hitting a reef, he calls me. I go down, rig it up, bring it back. The work is hard, often dangerous, but it's honest. The money I make is just enough to keep the Maiden running, the diesel tanks full, and a bottle of decent whiskey in the galley. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday in late autumn. The air had that sharp, clean bite to it that promises the season's first snow. I was on the deck, mending a winch cable, when my satellite phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize, scrambled, with no caller ID. Professional curiosity got the better of me. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, and had all the warmth of a legal document. He said he represented a company called Aperture Marine Services and that they had a priority retrieval job. He told me one of their geological survey sensors had detached from its mooring and settled on the lake bed. Simple enough. But then came the details that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The location was in one of the deepest parts of the lake, the Keweenaw Trench, nearly 1,300 feet down. That's ROV territory, remote operated vehicle. My personal diving limit, even with a mixed gas rebreather, is around 300 feet. I told him as much. That's a job for a submersible, sir. I'm just a salvage diver. We are aware of your limitations, Mr. Colton, the voice said, unfazed. The sensor is delicate. We need hands-on, not claws. We chose you because of your record with sensitive recoveries. Specifically, the naval drone you recovered off Manitow Island 2 years ago. That got my attention. That job was supposed to be sealed, a quiet contract directly with the Navy. For it to be in some corporate file meant this Aperture Marine Services was more than just a survey company. He continued, the job requires you to use your ROV. You will guide it to the target, secure the sensor in its retrieval cradle, and bring it to the surface. It is a sealed unit, approximately 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, cylindrical. It is not dangerous. The way he specifically said it wasn't dangerous made me immediately believe it was. Then came the offer. The number he quoted was more than I make in a good year, enough to buy a new boat, to retire, to disappear. Against every single one of my instincts, I heard myself agreeing. The money was wired to my account within the hour. The instructions were simple. Retrieve the object, bring it to a specific set of coordinates in a secluded bay by dawn on Thursday, and await further contact. I was to maintain complete radio silence. The next morning, I steamed out of the harbor before the sun had even kissed the horizon. The lake was calm, a sheet of dark glass. It took me half a day to reach the coordinates. There was nothing out here. No boats, no land in sight. Just an endless expanse of gray water under a gray sky. I double-checked the location. This was the place. I killed the engines, and the silence that descended was absolute. Just the gentle lapping of water against the Maiden's hull. I prepped my ROV, a little yellow submersible I called the Gopher.
It's a reliable piece of gear, equipped with a decent camera, sonar, and a pair of manipulation arms. As I lowered it over the side, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This was too quiet, too easy. The descent took over an hour. I sat in the dark of the cabin, my face illuminated by the monitor, watching the depth gauge tick steadily downward. 200 feet. The light from the surface was gone. 500 feet. The water pressure here is immense, enough to crush a car like a soda can. 900 feet. The lake bed began to appear on the sonar, a landscape of ancient silt and rock that hadn't seen the sun in millennia. At 1,280 feet, the gopher touched down. I switched on the high-intensity lamps, and their beams sliced through the eternal night. The lake bed was barren, a desert of fine-grained mud. I maneuvered the ROV, following the final GPS marker. And then I saw it. It was exactly where they said it would be. But it wasn't a sensor. It wasn't cylindrical. It was a pod, for lack of a better word. It was about the size they described, but it was shaped like a smooth obsidian seed. There were no seams, no rivets, no markings. It wasn't metal. It looked grown. The surface was a matte black that seemed to drink the light from my ROV. It was wedged slightly into the mud, as if it had settled there softly. It looked completely, utterly alien. My blood ran cold. This was no company's geological equipment. This was something else. I should have turned back. I should have cut the cord, pulled the gopher up, and steamed as far away as I could. But the money was already in my account. Plus, a deeper, more dangerous feeling had taken root. Curiosity. I guided the gopher closer. As the manipulation arms reached for it, I noticed something else. The water around the pod seemed to shimmer, just slightly, like a heat haze on a summer road. And through my headphones, I could hear a faint sound from the ROV's external microphone, a sound that shouldn't have been there. It was a low, resonant hum, a sound that felt more like a vibration in the bones of my skull. I took a deep breath, gripped the controls, and began the retrieval.
Gripping the controls in the cabin felt like I was defusing a bomb. My ROV's manipulator arms are strong, designed to cut cables and crank rusted valves, but they're not delicate. I guided the pincers to close around the body of the pod. I expected a solid, heavy clank of metal on whatever this thing was made of. Instead, there was nothing. The arms closed around it with a soft, dull thud, and the material seemed to absorb the pressure, giving just slightly like dense rubber before holding firm. On my screen, the pressure sensors for the arms gave me a reading that made no sense. For its size, the object should have weighed close to 1,000 pounds. The readout claimed it was barely 200. The hum intensified the moment the arms locked on. It traveled up the gopher's frame, through the tether cable, and into the console itself. The speakers in my cabin, which were only meant to be relaying the microphone feed from the lake bed, began to buzz with a low, steady frequency. It was a sound I could feel in my teeth. I disengaged the ROV's magnetic locks from the lake floor and began the ascent. Slowly, carefully, I winched the gopher and its impossible cargo up from the abyss. The whole way up, my equipment fought me. The video feed would flicker, ghosting with static. The sonar display would flash with phantom shapes moving just at the edge of its range, shapes that would vanish the moment I tried to focus on them. I told myself it was the object's energy field interfering with the electronics. I told myself that, but a cold part of my brain whispered that we were being watched, that by disturbing this thing, I had rung a dinner bell in the dark. The journey up felt 10 times longer than the journey down. Every minute was a new battle with the controls, a new wave of nauseating static buzzing from the speakers. Finally, after an eternity, I saw a faint, ghostly blue begin to permeate the darkness on the camera feed. The surface.
I brought the gopher alongside the Maiden's stern and used the main deck crane to lift it from the water. The little yellow sub broke the surface, streaming water, the black pod held firmly in its grasp. The contrast was startling. In the deep, it had looked sinister and mysterious. Up here, under the flat, gray light of the overcast sky, it looked even more alien. It didn't reflect the light, it swallowed it. Water beaded on its surface in perfect spheres, refusing to run, as if the material itself was hydrophobic on a level I'd never seen. I lowered the ROV onto a heavy-duty tarp on the deck. With the utmost care, I released the manipulator arms. The pod settled onto the tarp with a soft, heavy sigh. I powered down the gopher and the crane, and then there was silence. The buzzing in the cabin was gone. For a moment, all I could hear was my own heartbeat and the gentle rocking of the boat. I stood there 10 feet away from it, a cold sweat on my brow despite the chill in the air. What had I just brought onto my boat? What had I brought into my world? And that's when it happened. It wasn't an explosion. There was no sound. It was a silent, concussive pulse of something, of energy, of pressure. It felt like the air itself had solidified for a fraction of a second. A flash of pure white light erupted behind my eyes, and a wave of vertigo sent me stumbling back against the cabin wall. I didn't hear it with my ears, I felt it in my bones, a deep cellular thrum that vibrated through the steel deck and up my legs. It was over as fast as it began. I shook my head, my vision swimming, a coppery taste like I'd bitten my tongue filled my mouth. I looked up. The pod was unchanged. It sat there, inert and silent on the tarp. But everything else was different. Every single light on my console was dark. The navigation screen, the sonar, the radio, the backup GPS, all dead. I scrambled into the cabin and flipped the master circuit breaker. Nothing. I tried the radio's emergency battery. Lifeless. Every piece of delicate electronics on the Iron Maiden was fried. Utterly and completely fried, as if hit by a massive electrical surge. The only things that still worked were the old analog systems, the engine, the lights, and the magnetic compass. And the compass was spinning uselessly, the needle rotating in slow, lazy circles, completely untethered from magnetic north. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the undersides of the clouds in shades of blood orange and bruised purple. I was alone, in the middle of the largest freshwater lake on Earth, with no navigation except my eyes, and no way to call for help. And sitting on my deck was an object of unknown origin that had just demonstrated, without a sound, that it was far more than a simple piece of wreckage. The people who hired me weren't just retrieving a lost device, they were containing it, and I had just let it out of its cage. A cold, dreadful certainty washed over me. The job wasn't over. The retrieval was just the beginning.
Panic is a luxury you can't afford in the middle of Lake Superior. It's an indulgence that will get you killed faster than a cracked hull. I stood there on the deck for a long minute, the cold air stinging my lungs, and I forced it down. I sealed the fear away in a mental box, locked it, and focused on the facts. Fact 1, I was alive. Fact 2, the boat was still floating, and the old Detroit diesel in the engine room was a mechanical beast, untouched by whatever energy pulse had crippled my electronics. Fact 3, I was adrift on a compassless sea, with night falling fast. Navigation. That was the problem to solve. I went back to the wheelhouse and stared at the dead screens. They were just dark mirrors now, reflecting my own grim face. Useless. But my father, the man who taught me the ways of the lake, was an old salt who trusted celestial bodies more than satellites. He'd beaten the knowledge into me on countless nights just like this one. I dug out a dusty wooden box from under the chart table. Inside were my father's old tools, a brass sextant, a set of star charts, and a wind-up chronometer that hadn't been used in 20 years.
I wound the chronometer, its steady ticking, a small, comforting sound in the oppressive silence. I took a reading off Polaris, the North Star, which was just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. My hands were clumsy at first, the motions unfamiliar after years of relying on a glowing GPS dot. But the old knowledge was still there, buried deep. After a few minutes of calculation on a paper chart, I had a rough position and a heading. East-southeast, towards the mainland, towards the rendezvous. Before I fired up the engine, I walked back out onto the deck. The pod was still sitting there, a lump of perfect darkness against the gray tarp. The air around it felt neutral. The thrumming I'd felt was gone. I walked a slow circle around it, my boots heavy on the steel deck. Was it dormant? Waiting? I grabbed a long boat hook, my heart pounding, and cautiously extended it. I gently prodded the pod's surface. It was like touching stone, but without the cold. It felt neither warm nor cool, but room temperature, as if it existed in a perfect equilibrium with its surroundings. I rapped it harder. The sound was a dull, non-resonant thump, like hitting a solid block of vulcanized rubber. There were no answers here, only more questions. I covered it with another larger tarp, as if putting a blanket over a monster would somehow make it less real. Out of sight, but not out of mind. I went back to the helm, engaged the engine, and the Maiden's low rumble was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. I pushed the throttle forward, and we began to cut through the black water, leaving a pale, phosphorescent wake behind us. The journey was agonizingly slow. I had to constantly check my position against the stars, making small corrections. The lake is a different animal at night. The darkness is absolute, swallowing sound and light. You lose all sense of scale. The boat felt like a tiny, fragile shell, and the deep, cold blackness beneath us felt infinite. It was about 2 hours into the journey when I saw it. A light. It was far off the starboard bow, a single, bright white point of light, brighter than any star. It wasn't a boat. It moved too fast, darting left, then right with impossible speed. It wasn't a plane. It was too low to the water, and it made no sound. It hovered for a moment, and I felt a primal fear, a certainty that it was looking for me. I cut the engine and killed my lights, plunging the Maiden into total darkness. I stood in the wheelhouse, not daring to breathe, and watched. The light hovered for another minute, then it simply went out, vanished. I waited for 10 minutes in the suffocating silence before I dared to start the engine again. The message was clear. The pulse from the pod hadn't gone unnoticed. It was a flare, a beacon, and something had answered its call. Now, the hunt was on. Just before dawn, the bruised purple on the horizon gave way to a thin line of gray. I saw the silhouette of the shoreline, the dark, jagged teeth of pine and rock. I had made it. I found the bay from the coordinates, a narrow, secluded cove shielded by a high granite cliff on one side and a thick forest on the other. It was the perfect place for a clandestine meeting. I steered the Maiden into the cove, cut the engine, and let the boat drift the last 100 feet until it came to a gentle stop in the still, glassy water. And then I waited. The instructions were to await contact. I stood on the deck, my shotgun loaded with heavy slugs resting in the crook of my arm, and I watched the silent, unmoving shore. The air was cold and smelled of pine and damp earth. There was no sign of life. No cars on the dirt track I could faintly see through the trees. No lights. Nothing. Just me, my boat, and the thing hidden under a tarp on my deck, waiting for the faceless men who had paid me to bring it out of the dark.
Dawn is a slow, quiet thing on the lake. It doesn't burst over the horizon. It seeps into the world, turning black to navy, then to a soft, bruised gray. I watched it happen from the wheelhouse, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, the shotgun resting against the console. Every sound was magnified in the stillness of the cove. The call of a loon across the water sounded like a scream. The creak of the boat's mooring lines was a groan of protest. I was a bundle of raw, exposed nerves, wound tight. I had hours to think while I waited. Hours to replay the events. The impossible object on my deck, the pulse, the dead electronics, the light in the sky. These weren't the actions of a lost geological sensor, and the people who had hired me weren't scientists. They were something else. The money in my account felt less like a payment and more like a leash they would pull tight and then snap. My gut, the instinct that had kept me alive through countless storms and treacherous dives, was telling me that giving them the pod was the last thing I would ever do. Just as the sun's first rays cut through the morning mist, I saw it. It wasn't a boat, it was movement on the shore, on the dirt track I'd barely been able to see in the dark. A single, black, windowless van, something you'd see a federal agency use, rolled to a stop behind a curtain of pine trees. It made almost no sound. The doors slid open and 4 men got out. They were dressed in dark gray utility clothing, no logos, no insignia. They moved with a fluid, practiced economy, like a wolf pack. One of them, clearly the leader, was lean and tall, with a severe face I could see even from a distance. He raised a pair of binoculars and scanned my boat. He knew I was watching. For a full minute, we just stared at each other through our lenses. 2 predators, sizing each other up across 100 yards of misty water. My handheld radio, an old battery-powered model I kept in an emergency kit, crackled to life. "Mr. Colton, the channel is secure. Acknowledge." The voice was the same one from the phone call. Cold, impersonal. I picked up the radio, my hands slick with sweat. "I'm here," I said, my own voice sounding rough. "You have the asset. We are prepared to take delivery. Bring your vessel to the shore." I looked at the pod, still covered by the tarp. I thought about the light in the sky. I thought about how they knew about my sealed Navy job. "First, you tell me what it is," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. "The deal was for a sensor. That is not a sensor." There was a pause. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. When the leader spoke again, all pretense of civility was gone. "Our arrangement was for retrieval, Mr. Colton, not for a debriefing. Your curiosity is not part of the contract. Bring the asset to shore, now." "The contract is void," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. "You misrepresented the cargo and the risk." The leader on the shore didn't even bother to raise the radio. I saw him give a short, sharp nod to his men. In perfect unison, they reached into their jackets and pulled out suppressed pistols. They weren't police. They weren't military. They were here to clean up a mess, and I was part of it. "Last chance, Colton. Don't make this a recovery of your corpse as well." That was it. That was the moment. They started moving towards a small, inflatable skiff that had been hidden in the reeds. They were going to board me. I knew with absolute certainty that they would take the pod and then put a bullet in my head and scuttle my boat. The Iron Maiden would become just another one of Superior secrets. But she's my boat, and I know her every groan, every shudder. While they were preparing their skiff, I was already moving. I didn't run. I calmly walked to the helm, my mind a strange oasis of clarity in a sea of fear. I didn't even look at them. I put my hand on the throttle. It was an old brass handle, worn smooth by decades of use. I thought of my father. "Never let them corner you," he used to say. "The lake is big. Use it." As the first of the men stepped into the skiff, I slammed the throttle not forward, but hard astern. The Maiden's diesel engine, which had been idling quietly, let out a deafening roar. The stern dug into the water, and the boat didn't just move, it launched itself backward. A massive wave of churning white water erupted from the propeller, swamping their skiff and sending the men scrambling. The whole cove, so peaceful moments before, was chaos. I spun the wheel hard, putting the Maiden's stern towards the mouth of the bay and pushed the throttle to the firewall. A series of soft put sounds reached me over the engine's roar. Then came the metallic pings as bullets began to strike the steel hull of the wheelhouse. They were shooting at me. The reality of it was so absurd, so completely outside my life experience that I almost laughed. Almost. I zigzagged, making the Maiden as difficult to target as possible, pushing the old girl faster than she'd gone in years. I cleared the mouth of the cove and burst out into open lake, the rising sun at my back. I was a fugitive. I had no destination, no plan, and I was being hunted by men with silent guns and limitless resources. All I had was my boat, a tank of fuel, and the terrible, silent secret sitting on my deck.
For the first hour, I did nothing but drive. I pushed the Iron Maiden's throttle to its limit, my knuckles white on the brass handle, my eyes scanning the horizon behind me for any sign of pursuit. The engine roared, a constant, deep-throated growl that vibrated through the entire vessel. The shore vanished behind me, consumed by the vast, shimmering expanse of Lake Superior. There was nothing but water and sky. I was a tiny, insignificant speck running from ghosts. Slowly, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold, heavy certainty. My life, the simple, solitary life I had known, was over. There was no going back to my harbor in Marquette. There was no explaining this. Who would I tell? The Coast Guard? The police? I could already imagine their faces as I tried to explain the silent men with suppressed pistols in the impossible black pod on my deck. They would lock me in a padded room. The life of Jack Colton, salvage diver, had been officially salvaged. What was left was something else. A witness, a loose end, a man with a target on his back. As the boat slammed against a particularly large wave, I heard a sound from the deck behind me, over the drone of the engine. It was a low, resonant hum, the same hum I'd heard on the ROV's microphone deep in the trench. I throttled back, letting the engine settle into a slower rhythm, and the hum became more distinct. It was coming from under the tarp. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. It was as if the pod had been woken up by the violent escape, by the vibrations of the engine running at full power. It was active again. I put the engine in neutral and let the boat drift, the silence rushing back in. I walked out onto the deck and found several fresh, sharp-edged holes in the steel wall of the wheelhouse, clean, round bullet holes. They were real. A few inches to the left and they wouldn't have been in my boat, they would have been in me. The reality of it hit me like a physical blow. I leaned against the railing, the full weight of my situation finally crashing down. I was outmatched and outgunned. To survive, I couldn't just run. I had to disappear. And that's when I remembered a story my father used to tell. A ghost story almost. He called it Fisherman's Folly. A tiny, abandoned settlement tucked away in a deep, narrow inlet on the Canadian side of the lake. It was a relic from the early 20th century, a place that had died out when the fishing industry collapsed. It wasn't on any modern charts, and the inlet was supposedly shielded by a maze of rocky shoals, making it invisible from the open water. A place where a man and his boat could vanish completely. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on a half-remembered story.
but it was the only plan I had. I went back to my paper charts, my hands now steady with purpose. I found the general area he'd talked about. It would take the better part of the day to get there, a day spent exposed on the open water. I had to hope that whatever was hunting me would be looking in the wrong direction. I set my new course, not towards safety, but deeper into the vast, wild heart of the Great Lakes. The hum from the pod on my deck seemed to settle into a steady rhythmic pulse, a soft, alien heartbeat accompanying me on my journey into the unknown.
The journey north was a long, agonizing exercise in paranoia. With every hour that passed, the sun seemed to burn hotter, the lake felt wider, and my solitude became heavier. I was a mouse in an open field, praying the hawks weren't looking down. I kept the Maiden at a steady, fuel-conserving pace. My eyes were raw from scanning the horizon, my neck stiff from constantly checking the sky. A distant freighter became a Navy destroyer in my mind. A high-altitude passenger jet became a military spotter plane. I was running on coffee, fear, and the sheer stubborn refusal to die. The hum from the pod was a constant companion. It was a low, thrumming vibration that resonated through the deck and up into the wheelhouse. It wasn't loud, but it was omnipresent, a reminder of the strange passenger I had in my care. I couldn't leave it on the deck. It was too exposed. I had to move it. I wrestled it onto a heavy-duty dolly, the 200 pounds feeling more like 500. As my hands made contact with its surface, even through thick work gloves, I felt a strange tingling sensation, like static electricity, that ran up my arms. I wheeled it to the main cargo hold, a dark, cavernous space in the belly of the boat that smelled of diesel, rust, and cold iron. As I rolled the pod into the darkness, away from the direct sunlight, I saw something I hadn't seen before. The matte black surface wasn't entirely uniform. Faint, impossibly thin lines, almost like microscopic circuitry, were now glowing with a soft, internal deep blue light. They pulsed in time with the hum, a slow, steady rhythm like a sleeping heart. I had the distinct impression that I wasn't just hiding an object. I was hiding a living, or semi-living thing. I covered it with oil-stained tarps and old fishing nets, burying it as deep as I could, and sealed the hatch, though I knew the sound and the feeling would still be with me. The close call came in the late afternoon. I heard it before I saw it. The rhythmic whump, whump, whump of rotor blades. I looked up and my blood turned to ice. It was a helicopter, a black, unmarked machine like the van, cutting across the sky from the south at high speed. It wasn't searching. It was heading somewhere with purpose, and its flight path would take it directly over me. I had seconds to act. I cut the engine, grabbed a fishing pole from its holder, and stumbled to the stern, trying to look like a lone fisherman enjoying a day on the lake. I didn't look up, but I could feel the machine's shadow pass over me, its powerful downdraft whipping the water into a frenzy. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only 30 seconds. Then it was gone, continuing its journey north. My heart pounded against my ribs. Were they heading to the rendezvous point, or were they setting a trap? As evening approached, the rugged, desolate coastline of the Canadian North Shore emerged from the haze. It was a wall of ancient granite and dark pine trees, a wilderness that had never been tamed. According to my father's story and my own rough calculations, the entrance to Fisherman's Folly should be here somewhere, but there was nothing, just an unbroken line of cliffs and crashing waves. I began to despair, thinking the story was a fabrication, a sailor's tall tale. I was about to give up when I saw it. A peculiar rock formation shaped like a sea stack, just like my father had described. He said the entrance was right behind it, masked by a curtain of rock. It wasn't an entrance, it was a crack. A narrow channel barely wider than my boat, with jagged rocks lurking just beneath the surface. This was it. Taking a deep breath, I aimed the bow of the Iron Maiden into the maw of the rocks and began to navigate the treacherous passage, my life now depending on the half-forgotten words of my father.
The channel was a tight, nerve-wracking squeeze.
The hull of the Iron Maiden scraped against submerged rocks more than once, the sound a percussive shriek of tortured metal that went right through me. I navigated by inches, my face beaded with sweat, until finally the narrow passage opened up and the boat glided into a perfectly still, hidden basin. I killed the engine, and the silence that fell was the deepest I have ever known. I had arrived in Fisherman's Folly. It was a ghost town, preserved in the cold, clean air of the north. A collection of 24 small, ramshackle cabins and buildings clung to the rocky shore, their windows like vacant eyes. A rickety wooden pier, half collapsed into the dark water, stretched out like a skeletal hand. Rusting hulks of old fishing boats from a bygone era lay half submerged in the shallows, their ribs picked clean by decades of ice and water. The entire village was being slowly, inexorably swallowed by the immense boreal forest that surrounded it, with pine trees growing right through the floors of collapsing porches. It was profoundly lonely, deeply melancholy, and for me, it was the safest place on Earth. My first priority was hiding the Maiden. The basin was shielded from the open lake, but that black helicopter was still fresh in my mind. I motored slowly to the most dilapidated part of the pier, the section that was shrouded by a large, collapsing boathouse. I eased the boat into the shadows and spent the next hour using old, rotting fishing nets and faded tarps I found on the shore to cover her, breaking up her distinct shape. From the air, I hoped she would look like just another piece of forgotten wreckage. With the boat hidden, I took the shotgun and went ashore. Walking through the single, overgrown path that served as a main street was like stepping into the past. I peered into cabins, their doors long since rotted off their hinges. I saw dusty tables still set for meals that were never eaten, rusted tools hanging on walls, a child's worn leather shoe lying in a corner. It was a town that hadn't been evacuated. It had simply been abandoned, as if the residents had walked away one afternoon and never came back. The only sound was the wind whispering through the pines and the distant cry of a raven. I chose a small, sturdy-looking cabin set back against a granite cliff face. It was defensible, with a solid roof and only one way in. The inside was thick with dust and the smell of decay, but it was dry. This would be my base, my new home. For how long? I didn't know. As dusk began to settle, casting long, deep shadows across the cove, a faint, deep blue light began to emanate from the vents of the Iron Maiden's cargo hold, pulsing slowly in the growing darkness. The pod was still with me, its alien heartbeat a silent rhythm in my lonely sanctuary. I was no longer running. I was in hiding, a ghost in a town of ghosts, waiting for the hunters to make their next move.
Days in Fisherman's Folly bled into one another, marked only by the slow crawl of the sun across the sky. I settled into a strange, ghost-like routine. I explored the abandoned village, scavenging for anything useful. I found old cans of preserved food in a root cellar, still edible after half a century. I found a cast-iron stove that I got working, its warmth a small comfort against the creeping autumn chill. I spent hours simply watching the mouth of the channel, my shotgun always within reach, my senses honed to a razor's edge. I was a hermit, a sentinel, guarding a secret I didn't understand. My nights were spent with the pod. I couldn't leave it in the boat. A deep instinctual part of me knew it needed to be away from the water, away from the open. I painstakingly moved it from the Iron Maiden's cargo hold to the back of my chosen cabin. In the absolute darkness of the northern night, its internal blue light was mesmerizing. The faint, pulsing lines of circuitry had become brighter, more complex. They would occasionally trace new patterns across its surface, like thoughts rippling through a silent mind. The hum was still there,
a constant, low-frequency vibration that I no longer heard with my ears but felt in the floorboards and in my own chest. It wasn't menacing. It felt inquisitive. One evening, driven by a mixture of boredom and a desperate need for answers, I did something foolish. I reached out and placed my bare hand on its surface. The moment my skin made contact, everything changed. It wasn't a shock, it was a flood. Images, sounds, feelings, not mine, poured into my head. I saw a sky with two suns. I saw structures that defied gravity, impossibly tall and slender, piercing clouds of purple and orange. I felt a sense of immense travel, of crossing an impossibly vast and cold emptiness. And I felt a catastrophic, system-wide failure, a sense of falling, of crashing into a deep, cold, crushing blackness. It was a memory, the pod's memory of its arrival. I snatched my hand back, my heart racing, and fell back against the cabin wall, gasping for breath. The images faded, leaving behind a profound sense of loneliness and loss that wasn't my own. The pod wasn't a weapon, it wasn't a device, it was a life raft, a seed, a survivor. And the pulse it had sent out upon hitting the air wasn't a beacon for its hunters, it was a distress call, a cry for help. The men who had hired me, the men in the black van, they weren't a recovery team. They were a containment team, a sanitation crew sent to sterilize a contamination site. And I was now part of that contamination. This new knowledge shifted everything. I wasn't just hiding an object anymore. I was protecting a refugee that was slowly, methodically trying to repair itself in the back of my cabin. I began to spend more time with it, not as a warden, but as a caretaker. I would sit in the darkness for hours, just watching the silent, shifting light show on its surface. I dared not touch it again, but a strange, silent companionship grew in that dusty, forgotten cabin. Me, a man who had lost his life, and it, a being that had lost its entire world. We were two ghosts, haunting the same quiet corner of the earth, bound together by a shared enemy and a cold, deep lake.
The fragile peace of my exile was shattered by the changing of the seasons. The autumn air grew teeth, biting with the promise of the coming winter. The days grew shorter, the nights longer and colder. My world had shrunk to the size of this forgotten cove. My life measured in the dwindling supply of canned food and the slow, rhythmic pulsing of the alien in my cabin. I had started talking to it, at first out of sheer loneliness, then out of a genuine feeling that I was not alone. I'd tell it about the lake, about my father, about the life I used to have. I would sit there in the dark, my voice a low murmur, and the blue lights on its surface would shift and swirl, the patterns becoming brighter and more intricate when I spoke. I was certain it was listening. In return, it offered only its silent, humming presence. But it was enough. It was a companionship that transcended words. The trouble started not with a bang, but with a barely audible buzz. It was mid-morning and I was on a high ridge overlooking the lake. Scanning the horizon, I heard it first. A high-pitched, insect-like whine that was completely alien to the natural sounds of the forest. Then I saw it. A drone. It was a sleek, black, multi-rotor machine flying low and fast along the coastline, about a mile out. It was moving in a systematic grid pattern, a mechanical predator methodically sweeping the wilderness. My blood ran cold. They hadn't given up. They had escalated. They were searching for me with machines that didn't sleep and never got tired. I spent the next 2 days in a state of high alert, watching the drone from various hiding spots. It never entered the channel to the cove, but it passed the entrance twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening, its optical sensors and, I assumed, other more exotic detectors, scanning, always scanning. The camouflage on the Iron Maiden was good, but it wouldn't fool a dedicated search.
It was only a matter of time before they sent the drone into the cove itself or a team of men. Hiding was no longer enough. I had to become proactive. I had to become the ghost this town deserved. An idea began to form, a desperate, dangerous gamble that hinged on the pod itself. I had noticed that its energy field, the low hum and static tingle, seemed to intensify when the drone was nearby. It was reacting to being scanned. What if I could use that reaction? What if I could give the drone something to find, something that wasn't me and wasn't my boat? That night, under the sliver of a crescent moon, I put my plan into action. My goal was a small, deep-sea cave at the base of the cliffs about a half-mile down the coast from the main entrance to Fisherman's Folly. It was accessible only by a treacherous, overgrown goat path. Moving the pod was the hardest thing I've ever done. It was dense, awkward, and the entire time I felt a profound sense of sacrilege, of disturbing something sacred. I wrapped it in old blankets to try to hide its glow, and wrestled it onto a makeshift sled I'd built from the floorboards of a ruined cabin. The journey through the dark forest was a nightmare. I dragged and pushed the sled, my muscles screaming in protest, my lungs burning in the frigid air. The pod's hum seemed to intensify with every jolt, a low, mournful sound that felt like a complaint. The blue lights bled through the blankets, casting eerie, shifting shadows on the ancient pine trees around us, making them look like silent, skeletal giants. Twice I slipped, nearly sending the sled and its precious cargo careening down the rocky slope into the darkness. I felt like a thief, stealing the heart of my own sanctuary. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the cave. It was a dark, wet fissure in the rock, smelling of brine and decay. I slid the pod off the sled and gently pushed it as deep into the darkness as it would go. The moment I let go, the sense of companionship, the constant low-level thrum in my mind, vanished. The silence it left behind was deafening, a sudden and crushing loneliness. I felt exposed, unprotected. I had to force myself to turn and leave, to climb back to my watch point on the cliffs, leaving the pod alone in its cold, dark prison. I didn't have to wait long. The next morning the drone returned, its buzz an angry hornet song on the wind. It flew its usual pattern, but as it neared the section of the coast with the cave, it stopped. It hovered, its body tilting as its sensors focused intently on the cliff face. It descended slowly, getting closer and closer to the cave's mouth. I held my breath, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The drone hovered there for a full 10 minutes, a silent, mechanical inquisitor. I imagined the men watching its video feed, seeing the strange energy readings, marking the location. Then, as if satisfied, it ascended, turned, and flew off, continuing its search pattern further down the coastline, away from Fisherman's Folly. It had worked. I had bought myself time, but the cost was immense. My sanctuary was compromised, and my only companion was now bait. And I knew with a grim certainty that the silent men in their black van would be coming to investigate that cave very, very soon.
The silence that followed the drone's departure was heavier and more menacing than its noise had been. I had won the battle, but in doing so I had revealed that a war was coming. They knew something was in that cave, and they would not send a machine to investigate next time. They would send men. The clock was ticking, and every tick was a step closer to my sanctuary becoming my tomb. I didn't waste a second. My life as a salvage diver had been about calculated risks and understanding leverage, and I used every ounce of that knowledge. I spent the next 36 hours preparing, not for a fight, but for a retrieval. I rigged a simple lever system with a heavy log and old ropes near a loose rock face above the path to the cave, a quick way to create a rock slide and block the trail. I siphoned diesel fuel into a rusty, derelict boat on the shore, hoping its ancient engine might roar to life one last time to create a diversion. I was turning the entire ghost town into a piece of misdirection. They came on the second night, just after moonrise. It was a single boat, a long, black, low-profile vessel that cut through the water with almost no wake and no sound. It slipped through the main channel into the cove like a shark. 4 men disembarked onto an inflatable raft, the same men from the rendezvous, armed with assault rifles and equipped with night vision goggles. They moved with the same chilling efficiency, heading directly for the path that led towards the cave. I was watching from the shadows of a collapsing cannery, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. When they were halfway to the cave, I put my plan into motion. I had run a wire to the derelict boat, and from my hiding place, I sparked the connection to its battery. The old engine sputtered, coughed a cloud of black smoke, and then roared to life with a deafening, clattering protest that shattered the night's silence. The 4 men immediately froze, their weapons snapping towards the unexpected noise. It was the diversion I needed. As 3 of them cautiously moved to investigate the boat, leaving 1 to guard the path, I made my move. I sprinted from my hiding spot, my boots silent on the pine needles, and kicked the support for my makeshift lever. With a deep groan, the log rolled, and a ton of rock and earth crashed down, completely blocking the path. Now it was a race. I scrambled down an alternate, steeper trail to the sea cave. The single guard, hearing the rock slide and now cut off from his team, was shouting into his radio. I burst into the cave, the pod's blue light, a welcoming beacon in the darkness. There was no time to use a sled. I put my hands on it, ready to heave it, but as my skin made contact, I didn't try to pull, I pushed. I sent every ounce of my desperation, my fear, my fierce protective will into it. We have to go. They're here. Help me. The response was instantaneous and overwhelming. A wave of energy, of pure thought, surged back into me. It wasn't a memory this time. It was a conversation, a statement of intent. We go. The air in the cave grew thick, charged with ozone. The hum from the pod rose in pitch until it was a nearly unbearable, piercing whine. A brilliant white light erupted from its core, pouring out of the cave mouth. It wasn't a weapon, it was a tool. Outside, I heard shouts of confusion, the sound of rifles clattering to the ground. The light was followed by a pulse, not of force, but of pure systemic failure. Every piece of their advanced technology, their radios, their night vision, their boat's engine, died in that single, silent instant. In the disorienting, strobing aftermath, I grabbed the pod. It felt impossibly light, as if it were helping me, nullifying its own weight. I hauled it out of the cave and half ran, half stumbled back to the hidden Iron Maiden. I didn't look back. I threw the pod into the main cabin, fired up my reliable, purely mechanical diesel engine, and cast off the lines. I steered my boat through the narrow, rocky channel and out into the open waters of Lake Superior, leaving the 4 silent men and their dead technology stranded in the ghost town behind me. I am on the lake again now, but I am not running and I am not hiding. The pod rests on the bench in my cabin, its blue light a calm, steady glow, no longer a distress call, but a quiet presence. I can feel it, a sense of awareness, of gratitude. My old life is gone, lost to the cold depths, just like the secrets the lake keeps. But as the Iron Maiden cuts a path towards the dawn, I know this isn't an ending. We are 2 survivors, a man who has lost his world and a being who has lost its own, sailing on an ancient lake under a familiar sky. The distress call was answered, just not by the ones it was intended for. And somewhere out there in the cold, silent void it crossed to get here, there may be others. Friends or foes, I don't know. All I know is that our journey has just begun.